The military uprising that began in Morocco on July 17, 1936, quickly spread to almost all the peninsular, insular, and colonial garrisons of Spain. 4 days later, the rebellion had established indisputable control over the colonies, part of the Canary and Balearic archipelagos except Minorca, and a large sector of central Spain, although it still did not control Madrid or Barcelona. The insurrection progressed unevenly. In some places, it was reduced to a small core of the army supported by hastily armed worker militias. In others, it prevailed thanks to a combination of prior organization and support from conservative sectors who welcomed it with relief or imposed discipline. General Mola's prior instructions clearly defined the spirit of the coup. The operation had to be an act of war in all its brutality, aimed at imposing a new order. The general recommended acting without extreme hesitation against the enemy, and planned a staged uprising starting with the African troops, supported by the peninsular garrisons, with the objective of taking the most difficult cities, especially Madrid and Barcelona. His fifth instruction, dated June 20th, had been explicit: "Those who are not with us are against us, and as enemies will be treated." The uprising began in Melilla on the scheduled day and hour and succeeded immediately. Commanders loyal to the Republic were arrested, imprisoned, or executed after attempts at resistance. General Romorales, Captain Alvarez Buila, and other officers were executed. In Tetuan, Commander Ricardo Lapuente Bahamonde also fell. On July 18th, the uprising quickly spread throughout the city. That same day, the violence initiated by the rebels caused the deaths of numerous Republican commanders and militiamen in the first clashes. To impose control, calculated terror was used following Mola's directives. Summary executions, exemplary punishments, and a climate of fear intended to dismantle any resistance. In proclamations issued by the rebels, the Republic was accused of leading the country to moral and material ruin, destroying wealth and creating hunger, delivering the nation to revolutionary hordes. The army, the navy, and the public order forces, they claimed, had to defend the homeland according to the resistance they encountered. From the Canary Islands, Franco assumed command of the Army of Africa and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with his troops to land in Andalusia and begin the march on Madrid. A fundamental fracture affected the development of the insurrection. Although the rebels relied on widespread adherence from the army, this support was partial. Only about half of the Civil Guard and Assault Guard personnel supported the rebellion, and barely a third of the customs officers. Such division prevented a quick victory and forced the rebels to contest every territory, leading to open warfare instead of the swift military coup envisioned following the model of Primo de Rivera in 1923. From the outset, the conflict assumed a character of extreme violence, especially during the summer of 1936, when both sides applied indiscriminate reprisals. In the rebel zone, Mola promoted a policy of physical elimination of political opponents, union leaders, and suspected leftists, carried out by phalangists and Carlists. The aim was to cleanse the conquered territories of any opposition, and the general himself justified the use of terror as a necessary instrument to establish a new order. Meanwhile, the collapse of the Republican state, accelerated by the uprising, hindered the control of public order and fueled violence unleashed by worker sectors and militias that attacked right-wingers, priests, and civilians identified with the conspirators. The result was a widespread climate of fear and death, especially intense in the first weeks. The most significant advances of the rebels began on July 18th itself. In Galicia, Asturias, and parts of Castilla y León, many garrisons joined the rebellion. In Seville, General Queipo de Llano took the city through a rapid operation and controlled most of western Andalusia. In Zaragoza, General Cabanellas secured the loyalty of the Aragonese capital. In Navarra, Mola counted on the immediate support of thousands of Carlist requetés mobilized within hours. The uprising continued to spread in the following days. On July 19th, part of Catalonia fell in an early insurrection, although their worker resistance prevented its success. Madrid resisted thanks to the firmness of the governments of Casares Quiroga and later Martínez Barrio, who attempted a negotiated solution without achieving the submission of the rebellious military. The rebels in the capital were reduced or surrounded after the fiercest fighting in the Montaña barracks, where resistance ended with the death of General Fanjul and the surrender of the defenders. On July 20th, the last successful military uprisings took place. La Coruña, Vigo, and El Ferrol fell into insurgent hands after the removal of loyal commanders and heavy fighting in the barracks. That same day, part of Vitoria joined the rebellion, and Oviedo came under the control of Colonel Aranda, who entrenched himself with his troops in the city. The resulting map, shown in the source illustration, displayed large rebel zones in the north, northwest, and south, while the Mediterranean Strip and much of central Spain remained under Republican control. However, July 20th also brought a devastating blow for the rebels: the death of General Sanjurjo in an air accident while traveling from Lisbon to assume the supreme leadership of the movement. With his disappearance, the rebels lost the leader recognized from the very start of the operation, which heightened political and military uncertainty. Even so, the uprising had definitively succeeded in the African colonies, the Canary and Balearic archipelagos, a strong Andalusian core including Seville, Cadiz, Córdoba, and Granada, and a broad central northwest area from La Coruña to Huesca and from Cáceres to Teruel, incorporating regions of Galicia, León, and Old Castile, as well as Álava, part of Extremadura and western Aragon. Territorial control remained fractured, dividing Spain into two irreconcilable blocs. The government of Cáceres Quiroga, aware of the gravity of the situation, sought support among trusted military commanders and had more than 6,000 civil guards and assault guards in the province of Madrid. However, the conspirators had unsuccessfully probed several key leaders in the region, including General Miaja and Colonel Rojo. These commanders quickly realized that the rebels' only chance of success lay in a swift victory through massive use of the army, but they judged that Madrid would be firmly defended by loyal forces and mobilized worker militias. Government surveillance of the barracks proved decisive, especially in Carabanchel and Montaña, while keeping the commanders most inclined to conspiracy under control. The rebels, however, counted on the explicit support of leaders like General Fanjul, who entrenched himself in Montaña, waiting for reinforcements that never arrived. Determined to suppress the rebellion, the government took extreme measures. It ordered the discharge of troops suspected of obeying rebel commanders and authorized the distribution of weapons to party and union militants demanding to fight the insurrection. Loyal troops combined with militias to assault the Montaña barracks on July 20th, defeating the rebels after intense resistance marked by the death of most of their defenders. That same day, government forces recaptured Badajoz and thwarted a rebel attempt in Guadalajara. The failure of the rebellion in Madrid and Barcelona marked a decisive point. The fall of both cities sealed the impossibility of an immediate rebel victory and forced the country into a prolonged open war. General Martínez Monge's decision in Valencia to remain loyal to the Republic added another setback for the conspirators and secured Republican control of the Levantine region. The failure of the uprising in Malaga further strengthened the Southern Republican front, combined with the loss of Almeria and the government's control of the main naval bases. In the north, Santander, Oviedo, and Álava became the main rebel strongholds, sustained with difficulty due to the absence of unified command. The rebels' inability to seize Madrid and Barcelona, combined with Sanjurjo's death, tilted the initial strategic balance in favor of the Republic. By the end of July, Spain was divided into two clearly defined territorial blocs, a direct result of the failed coup that had sparked the Civil War. Before the first week of the uprising had passed, the rebels had not succeeded in overthrowing the Republican government in half the country, nor in assuming control of the state across the national territory, and they had lost their supreme leader in an air accident just 4 days after the coup began. The Republican government was also unable to effectively suppress the rebellion, managing to do so in only half of Spain, but at the cost of losing almost its entire army, arming uncontrollable civilian militias, and witnessing the collapse of a significant part of the state apparatus. This near balance of successes and failures transformed the military coup into a civil war of uncertain outcome and unpredictable duration. The assessment of the first days showed that by the end of July 1936, the territorial division of the country was already an irreversible fact. Two large opposing zones fragmented by violence. The territory under Republican control represented 53.5% of the national area, with about 270,000 of the total 505,000 square kilometers, included 22 of the 50 provincial capitals, and was home to 14.5 million inhabitants, 60% of the population. It was a densely populated, urbanized area with the country's largest industrial presence, including Basque steel, Asturian mining, and Catalan textile and chemical industries. However, it had limited local food resources, except for the Levantine fruit and vegetable production. The rebel-controlled territory encompassed 46.5% of the national area, about 235,000 square kilometers, with 28 provincial capitals and 10 million inhabitants. It was more rural and less densely populated. Its modern industrial infrastructure was weak, although it had significant agricultural, livestock and fishing resources. 2/3 of national wheat and potato production, 60% of legumes, 75% of milk, and 70% of sheep. The geographical distribution showed contrasts between countryside and industry, but also a clear division between regions capable of sustaining the war and others dependent on external supply. In financial terms, the Republic maintained control over 65% of bank offices and central deposits of the major Spanish banks. In addition, it retained most of the gold reserves of the Bank of Spain, whose transfer would later serve as international payment to maintain the supply of strategic imports. The rebels only managed to control 35% of the bank offices, mitigating the resource shortage through foreign credits and disciplined management of available assets. Militarily, the rebels had gained the support of more than half of the army's commanders and officers, about 8,000 men with professional capacity to conduct the war. They had also managed to control most of the replacement soldiers and a large part of the security forces, a total of 140,000 men, including all the experienced troops from Morocco, equipped with structure, gear, and operational chain of command. But their enemies controlled the majority of the 116,000 replacement soldiers and slightly more than 7,500 commanders and officers, although they suffered disorganization caused by the decision to discharge troops suspected of disloyalty and the shortage of fully reliable personnel. The distribution of forces in the Navy reflected this balance. The Republic retained most of the fleet, but the rebels had the symbolic support of key units and control of the strategic naval base of Ferrol. Regarding aviation, the Republic retained 207 aircraft, while the rebels controlled 96, most of them old and outdated. Both sides, as James Matthews noted, depended on the initial enthusiasm of young volunteers. In the Republican zone, more than half were socialists, anarchists, or communists. In the Francoist zone, phalangists and traditionalists predominated. However, it soon became clear that enthusiasm alone was insufficient to sustain a prolonged war. The Republic took months to mobilize new drafts due to the anti-militarist distrust of its base, while the rebels began in July 1936 a continuous recruitment process that, over the course of the war, would total 1.2 million men. From October, the Republic also began mobilizing replacements that would reach 1.7 million. By the end of July 1936, a hastily configured Spain had emerged, divided into two opposing sides with equivalent forces and insufficient internal resources to sustain a long war. The coup became a first-order strategic problem. In a country with limited industry and a disorganized army, the only way to maintain the fight depended on access to external resources. Neither side could guarantee the production of sufficient weaponry. The rebels sought help from the French Popular Front government, while Franco sent emissaries to Berlin and Rome to request planes and arms to transfer troops from Africa to the peninsula. Both requests implied recognition that the war could not be resolved without international support. The conflict was internationalized from the start, with decisive consequences for the initial balance. France hesitated to aid the Republic, fearing a diplomatic clash with the European authoritarian governments. Mussolini and Hitler responded more quickly to Franco's requests, sending equipment, aircraft, and advisors. This flow of external aid strengthened the military cohesion of the rebels and enabled the establishment of an air bridge between Morocco and the peninsula, a crucial factor in sustaining the advance toward Madrid. The defense of Madrid. Mola's initial idea was to achieve victory in a few days through a single large operation. To take Madrid, for which a simultaneous offensive from 5 directions was planned, also relying on the garrisons within the capital itself, But the initial plans were not fulfilled. The rebels understood that occupying the state capital, the political, economic and social center of Spain, would legitimize their cause before international opinion and cut off the communications and leadership capacity of the Republican government. For the defenders, however, the fate of Madrid meant the very fate of the Republic. In the first days following the insurrection, the military situation revealed the profound difference between the two sides. The insurgents had an organized army. The Republicans had to form one from scratch after the institutional collapse caused by the rebellion of most of the army. The government handed weapons to the people, and masses of militiamen took on the defense of Madrid. Many fled before the violence of the fighting, but others managed to push back the rebel advance. Improvisation marked every defensive action. In the following days, while the Republic tried to reorganize its command, the militias defeated the insurgent strongholds at Campamento and especially the Montaña barracks. The victorious entry of the anarchists into that bastion symbolized the initial triumph of the resistance and generated scenes of jubilation throughout the city. The armament distributed by the Girol government was divided among political and union organizations without clear military criteria, which was reflected in the limited capacity of the first columns formed on July 21st to fight in the Madrid mountains. There, at passes such as Navacerrada, Somosierra and Guadarrama, the militia columns managed to halt Molla's forces until the end of July in battles that caused numerous casualties. From these battles emerged figures such as Lista, Modesto, Campesino, Cipriano Mera, and Julio Mangada, the latter becoming a popular symbol in Madrid. At the beginning of August, the Madrid front stabilized, a clear sign of the failure of the military coup. Both sides had to reorganize their strategies. The Republic, in the midst of disorder, replaced War Minister Castelló with Hernández Saravia, and by mid-month the Central Spain Theatre of Operations was created under the command of General Riquelme. The rebels, meanwhile, decided to rely on the African army, seasoned regulares and legionnaires from the colonial war, about 24,000 men with real offensive capability. Franco, having arrived in Tetuan on July 19th, assumed command, proclaiming that the movement was unstoppable. The main difficulty lay in transferring these troops to the peninsula, as the navy remained largely loyal to the Republic. The insurgents then depended on foreign aid. Germany sent its first planes on July 29th, and a day later Italy sent Savoia Marchetti aircraft. This aid allowed the organization of an air bridge to transport legionnaires and regulares to Seville. Portugal, in turn, immediately provided material and logistical support, crucial in areas such as Cáceres, where even fuel supply was managed from Lisbon when local reserves ran out. Once the flow of African troops was consolidated, the march toward Madrid was planned from Seville under Yagüe's command. An advance through Córdoba was considered, but the Despeñaperros Pass was heavily defended by miners from La Carolina, who had mined the access points. Therefore, the Extremaduran route was chosen: Mérida, Cáceres, Navalmoral de la Mata, Toledo, and finally Madrid. Portugal's influence along this route reinforced the strategic advantage of the chosen path. The François columns advanced rapidly along the Ruta de la Plata, demonstrating superior military capacity and employing severe repressive methods. After occupying Mérida on August 11th, Yagüe proclaimed the existence of the Madrid column, declaring that nothing would stop its advance. Even so, Franco ordered a diversion toward Badajoz, a republican city near Portugal and strategically indispensable. The city fell on August 14th after intense fighting. This marked the end of the first phase of the march toward Madrid. The advance continued through Cáceres and reached Talavera de la Reina on September 3rd, placing the François forces only 100 kilometers from the capital. The Republican delay in occupying naval Morral proved fatal. Azaña lamented not having taken the town when it was defended by barely 100 civil guards, as they fortified the area and created a chain of positions that facilitated the François entry toward Madrid. By mid-September, the African troops had covered 500 kilometers in a month, confirming the strategic effectiveness of the Extremaduran route. The capture of the Alcázar of Toledo became a political turning point. Moscardo had been holding out since July with 1,000 men, and Franco, who had promised to assist him, diverted his army to Toledo when it was already at Madrid's gates. The operation delayed the advance by 2 weeks, allowing the defenders to organize better and receive the first Soviet shipments of material. Politically, however, it elevated Franco. On September 21st, he was appointed head of the Unified Command, and on October 1st, head of state. The image of Franco entering the ruins of the Alcázar, widely disseminated internationally, consolidated his leadership. Meanwhile, the Republic reorganized its forces under the new government of Largo Caballero, formed after the fall of the Giral cabinet. Command was centralized in the Ministry of War, the security and rearguard militias were created, and the formation of the Popular Army was decreed on October 10th. The creation of the International Brigades was also authorized, with deployment occurring at the end of the month. In early November, with Francois troops at the city's gates, the government decided to relocate to Valencia to avoid capture. General Miaja remained in command of Madrid, with Vicente Rojo as chief of the general staff. On November 6th, the Francois offensive against the capital began with around 15,000 men. What was expected to be a lightning operation extended until March 1937. The rebels attacked frontally via the Toledo, Segovia, Franceses and Princesa bridges, relying on repeating the linear advance that had been effective in their march from Seville. But the Madrid defense, despite being heterogeneous and initially disorganized, resisted with unexpected determination. Soviet aid in artillery, armored vehicles and aviation was added to the arrival of the International Brigades, whose presence boosted popular morale, as did the famous slogan that became a symbol of Madrid resistance, "They shall not pass." Durruti's Catalan column added another moral and military impetus to the defenders. For the first time since July, the Republic efficiently organized its rear. Armament, medical services, logistics and transportation were coordinated to sustain the fight within the city. By late November, the Francois operations halted upon realizing that frontal attacks could not break the defense. The Africanist army, victorious until then, experienced its first decisive check. The battle focused with particular intensity on Casa de Campo and the university city, where house to house and building by building fighting halted the enemy advance. The intense German bombings could not break Republican resistance. In the resumption of operations, the Francois attempted to encircle the city from northwest to southwest, but encountered a popular army growing in both numbers and discipline, aided by continuous mobilization and accelerated training. Meanwhile, Madrid remained isolated from the north, west and south. Only the Valencia road remained open, and it was evident that control of it would be decisive for both sides. The rebel plan aimed to advance from Getafe and cut this route to encircle the capital. The operation began on February 6th. The weather was terrible. On the night of the 5th, as slight signs of improvement appeared, the Francois military machine got underway. Troop movements began in Getafe, Pinto and Leganes, concentrating under Varela's command in Pinto. The attack was planned in three directions. Rada would advance from Cabeza Fuerte toward Vertice Coberteras via La Marañosa. Buruaga would take Casa de Gosques. Asensio would advance toward San Martín de la Vega. The Republican army could not anticipate from which point the main blow would come. The Pindoca Bridge was considered crucial, and the 5th Francois Regiment moved toward it. In the area, 3 Republican squadrons of Polikarpov 116 attempted to contain the enemy, but the German anti-aircraft batteries of the Condor Legion forced them to retreat. Between Cerro de los Angeles and Vallecas, artillery exchanged fire throughout the day. By 5 in the afternoon, the day's objectives were achieved for the rebels. La Marañosa, Vertice Coberteras, and the surrounding heights had fallen, fixing the front on the south bank of the Manzanares and at San Martín de la Vega, where a small resistance pocket still persisted. During the night of February 7th, the Republicans mobilized, albeit amid great confusion. The order given to the 18th Brigade to defend Ciempozuelos revealed the chaos, as the town had fallen the previous day and the unit was practically destroyed. From Albacete, the newly trained 15th International Brigade was hastily transferred, composed of British, American, Balkan, French and Spanish battalions. Meanwhile, the rebels reinforced La Marañosa and its defenses, but heavy rains in those days prevented the advance toward Vertice Coberteras, forcing them to remain on the previous hill. On February 8th, the Republicans tactically reorganized their defenses and amassed forces with the aim of wearing down the enemy. To divert troops from the Jarama area, they launched a counterattack in Madrid's Parque del Oeste. Even so, the Francois ultimately took Vertice Coberteras, and the Republican positions fell back to the bank of the Manzanares. The Espolón de Vacia-Madrid also fell into the hands of the 2nd Tabor of Melilla Regulares, a key position they would hold for the remainder of the battle. On February 9th, rain halted supplies to La Marañosa, forcing improvised truck transit over wooden beams. The Jarama meadows were impassable, making the Pindoque Bridge the only viable crossing point. On February 10th, it was decided to take it despite being mined, as its location allowed for a rapid advance under artillery support. At 3 o'clock in the early hours of February 11th, 6 men advanced stealthily across the bridge and surprised the Republican sentries. The sappers managed to defuse 4 of the 5 explosive charges. The last one detonated but did not damage the structure. The Republicans retreated eastward, and after heavy fighting, the Francois troops fortified the Casas de Pajares. That day, the rebels had achieved most of their objectives. They had crossed the river and established a bridgehead. In the early hours of February 12th, the Republicans reorganized and fortified their positions. The rebels expected to take Arganda on the left, Morata on the right, and advance through the center with Buruaga's brigade. This marked the beginning of the bloodiest phase of the entire battle. The 3rd Tabor from Tetuan crossed the San Martín de la Vega bridge, and the 8th Band of the Legion took Cerro del Pingarrón with hardly any resistance. Fierce clashes occurred in the hills near the Morata Road between International Brigadiers and Asensio's troops. The British battalion suffered the heaviest losses. 225 of its 600 men fell defending positions on White House Hill, which from then on became known as Suicide Hill. Nationalist casualties were also very high: 468 in Buruaga's column, 146 in Baron's, and 104 in Asensio's. The day revealed the enormous wear suffered by both sides, while the Republicans gained time to receive reinforcements from the Levant. On February 13th, the rebels held their objectives at Arganda, Morata, and Pingarrón, but barely altered the front lines despite reaching heights near Vertis de Valdeperdices. On the 14th, casualties and lack of supplies forced the suspension of the Francoist advance for the first time. The 14th International Brigade surrounded enemy positions at Valdeperdices and Cerro Milano, while Soviet tanks supported Republican counterattacks. Nationalist artillery finally allowed the Republicans to regain ground. The government decreed a general mobilization of men between 20 and 45 years old. Since February 6th, the rebels had accumulated 1,200 casualties, 700 of them on that day. On February 15th, the Francoists continued trying to dominate the Tajuña Valley. The 5th Band of the Legion took the Casa de la Radio but lost it shortly afterward in a counterattack. Asensio attempted to take Cota 700, defended by remnants of the British battalion, without achieving decisive gains. On February 16th, under Miaja's command, the Republicans carried out a deep reorganization. The fighting caused more than 500 casualties among the rebels, although Asensio finally managed to take Cota 700 near Morata. On February 17th, with trenches very close together, moments of great confusion occurred. Republican attacks targeted Pingarrón, while nationalists counterattacked at La Marañosa and Espolón de Rivas. On February 18th, the Modesto group attempted to surprise Vertis Coberteras without success. The Italian columns would operate between the Henares and Tajuña rivers, with their main axis along the Zaragoza road. Weather, however, became a key factor. After a dry and warm February, March brought cold spells, persistent rain, and strong winds. On the 8th, when the offensive was supposed to begin, a cold front crossed the area, causing zero visibility and heavy precipitation. Despite warnings from the Spanish commanders, Roata ordered firing to begin at 7 a.m. A bombardment of 120 pieces preceded the advance of tanks and infantry, breaking the initial lines. But the worsening weather forced the suspension of artillery support, paralyzed the rebel air force as runways were flooded, and, in contrast, allowed the Republic to maintain some air support. Only the central column and its right flank advanced between 6 and 12 kilometers. The 9th was even worse. Snow-soaked troops and equipment poorly prepared for the cold. Miaja sent reinforcements from the Jarama and concentrated tanks in Torilla. The International Brigades clashed with the Italian armored forces, but the Italians managed to advance another 15 to 18 kilometers to the outskirts of Brihuega. There they stopped to rest, losing momentum. The Italian mechanized units began to get stuck in the mud when leaving the roads. Their Fiat Ansaldo tanks, weighing only 3 to 5 tons with 43 horsepower, became blocked in the clay soils, and wheeled armored vehicles could not advance off the asphalt. The lack of winter gear, hot food, and air support undermined their morale. On the 10th, despite slight improvement, the Italian airstrips remained unusable while Republican aviation targeted roads crowded with enemy vehicles. The Garibaldi battalion arrived, and the first clash between T-26 tanks and Italian tankettes occurred, demonstrating the superiority of the Soviet armor. During the night, an Italian detachment reached Brihuega and captured the town without securing the surrounding heights. On the Zaragoza road, they advanced to Trijueque, while the Marzo Brigade secured the Atienza-Guadalajara route. On the 11th, a new storm darkened the front with heavy rain, fog, and wind. Italian aviation was again rendered ineffective. Nevertheless, they captured Trijueque with flamethrower tanks, and their advanced units reached Kilometer 75, their maximum advance. But the Italian right flank remained dangerously exposed. The Republicans reinforced the Brihuega forest and tripled their defenses with infantry divisions and tanks. Each Republican air attack further crushed Italian morale, trapped in the mud and without hot food. Roata then ordered a 24-hour pause, expecting a Francois attack from the Jarama that never came. The Marzo Brigade achieved successes at Cogoludo, surrounding Republican units, but the overall situation for the Italians was precarious. On the 12th, with unstable weather, the Republicans launched a counterattack on the plains, occupying almost all the heights around Brihuega. The destruction of a bridge in the Francois rear cut off Italian supplies. Afternoon improvements allowed some enemy aircraft to take off. That night, CTV commanders managed to reorganize the lines, relieving the troops exhausted by the Littorio division. On the 13th, the Italians abandoned Trijueque and retreated to Kilometer 82. The Republicans executed an envelopment maneuver around Brihuega, forcing another withdrawal. The Marzo Brigade halted its advance to avoid further exposing its flank. Between the 14th and 17th, the front stabilized. Republican aviation operated without serious opposition, and the Palacio de Ibarra fell after a battle between CTV Italians and the Garibaldi battalion. On the 15th, Roata asked Franco to relieve the CTV, but he refused. He ordered a 4-day pause. Meanwhile, the Republicans prepared an offensive for the 18th. On the 18th, under a sky covered by a new storm, Republican forces crossed the Tajuña at dawn, took Hill 1024 and controlled the Italian retreat route. By midday, they launched an attack with 50 tanks, artillery, and aircraft. On the plains, the Littorio resisted, but in the south, the Republican offensive encircled the Italian bridgehead. Believing they were surrounded, CTV commanders ordered a retreat. Brihuega fell by mid-afternoon. Italian units vanished toward Gajanejos, Kilometer 90. Between the 19th and 23rd, under continuous rain and final snowfall, the Republicans advanced to Ledanka Hontanares and Ledanka Utande Muduex Cogoludo, while the Budiel Valley prevented them from surpassing the Marzo Brigade's position. Along the Gajanejos line, the Italians held out until the 23rd, when they began to be relieved by Spanish troops, and exhausted Republican commanders suspended the offensive, declaring the battle concluded. The Francois offensive in the north, meanwhile, Franco aimed to overwhelm the militia resistance, and to achieve this, he knew he had to advance toward the Mediterranean. The northern campaign operations began at the end of March 1937. On March 31st, the offensive on the province of Biscay started from previously conquered positions, targeting the industrial heart of the Basque country. Within a few days, the rebels tightened the siege on Basque territory, combining air and naval superiority as the Republican fleet was concentrated in the Mediterranean, and the rebels imposed an early blockade in the Cantabrian Sea, which isolated the northern Republicans from any external aid. April 26, 1937 marked a brutal milestone. Planes from the German Condor Legion, along with air units of the Francois side, bombed the town of Gernika. The bombing caused a disaster among the civilian population and destroyed much of the urban area. 3 days after the attack, the rebel forces occupied the city. With Guernica subdued, the advance toward Bilbao accelerated. The Basque defences, composed of the provincial army, workers' militias and local gudaris, tried to resist around the so-called Iron Belt that protected the industrial capital. But the defensive plan had been severely compromised. The conspirators had obtained the fortification plans, which allowed the national troops to penetrate through its weak points. In addition, an intense campaign of bombardments on Bilbao and its surroundings through heavy artillery and aviation further deteriorated the morale of the defenders and the population. On June 19th, Bilbao fell. Its loss not only represented the conquest of a strategic and industrial centre where steel was minted, ironworks were produced, and a vital manufacturing structure existed, but also dealt a decisive blow to the Basque territory. After Bilbao's fall, the Basque front was practically broken, and the Republic lost its stronghold in Biscay. The offensive continued westward toward Cantabria. In mid-August, the Francoist forces launched their attack on the Santander region. On August 14th, the offensive toward that area began, with a diversion toward the mountains from Reynosa and simultaneous operations along the coast. The Republican defenders, composed of Cantabrian militias and remaining loyal troops, disorganized and with scarce resources, could not effectively resist the combination of maritime blockade, aerial bombings, and ground advances by the enemy. On August 24th, the rebel troops occupied Santander, following the surrender of the loyal forces, weakened by the shortage of food, fuel, and the effects of the siege. The fall of Santander represented a new step toward the collapse of the Northern Republican front. Northern communications with the rest of the loyal territory were practically cut off, and the possibility of supplies by sea was nullified by the Francois naval blockade. With Biscay and Cantabria already in the hands of the rebels, the focus shifted to the Asturian region, which had become the last Republican stronghold in the north. There, between September and October 1937, the Asturias offensive, the final phase of the campaign, took place. The Francois troops, numerically superior with better artillery, aviation and support from foreign allies, penetrated Asturian territory from the south and east, while the Condor Legion dominated the skies. The defenders, mainly workers and reorganized Republican soldiers, entrenched themselves in mountainous positions, relying on the rugged geography as a shield. Intense fighting occurred for days in mountain passes, gorges, coastal areas and natural passages closing the Cantabrian range. The Republican defensive lines tried to contain the enemy advance, while supplies arrived with great difficulty as the area was isolated by land and sea from the rest of loyal territory. Between September 6th and 22nd, the Battle of El Mazuco was fought, an emblematic episode of Asturian resistance. Despite being deeply outnumbered with about 33,000 insurgent soldiers against fewer than 5,000 Asturian defenders, the Republicans managed to temporarily halt the Francois advance, taking advantage of the mountainous terrain and weather to harass the enemy troops. But the nationalists' air and material superiority, combined with the defenders' exhaustion and logistical difficulties, ultimately tipped the balance. In the final days of the offensive, the pressure became unbearable. The mountain passes were captured one after another, coastal and passage areas were occupied, and the encirclement closed in on the Asturian cities. On October 21st, Francois forces entered Gijón and Avilés, conquering the last Republican strongholds in the north and ending the Republic's presence in that area. With the fall of Asturias, the northern campaign came to an end. All of northern Spain had been seized from the Republican government. Biscay, Cantabria, and Asturias fell to the Francois side within a few months. For the rebels, the victory was twofold. They gained control of essential industrial and mining resources and freed tens of thousands of soldiers who could be redirected to the southern front. The Republican defeat was not only military but also strategic. The impossibility of maintaining supply by sea, the extent of the aerial blockade over cities, ports, and supply routes, the isolation of the north, and the internal disorganization of militias with logistical weakness, command disarticulation, and conflict between different regional forces undermined any possibility of prolonged resistance. The fall of the north ultimately meant the loss of heavy industry, Asturian coal, Basque iron, key steel and metallurgical centers, as well as ports and maritime communications. All of this constituted a fundamental economic blow to the Republican war effort. Control of the Cantabrian Sea also allowed the rebel fleet to move to the Mediterranean, altering the naval balance and freeing forces to concentrate on new fronts. Francois' political unification and Franco's consolidation. On October 1, 1936, in Burgos, the Francois regime was born based on a military dictatorship with a collegiate command that had handed its omnipotent powers to one of its members, immediately elevated to leader of the state. From that moment, the new dictator sought to present himself as the embodiment of Spain's unity, using a language of national reconquest and legitimizing his figure with quasi-sacred titles that combined political, military, and religious power. This personal power supported a dictatorship that, at its inception, was organized through the State Technical Board, an administrative body serving as a bridge between the military command and an emerging civil structure. Presided over by General Davila and General Francisco Gómez Jordana, the Technical Board was composed of commissions of civilians loyal to the rebel side: journalists, traditional intellectuals, Carlists, Catholic engineers, jurists, and businessmen. Although ultimate authority rested with Franco, this body allowed the regime to begin shaping the foundations of its future state. Spain was thus organized under a totalitarian concept encompassing political, social, and economic life, inspired by European fascist models but adapted to Spanish authoritarian traditions. The state was built as a unified apparatus around the leader, with military supremacy and the explicit support of the Catholic Church. This accelerated process of institutionalization responded to the unexpectedly prolonged war. Continuous offensives on the northern, southern, and eastern flanks of Madrid between late 1936 and early 1937 forced Franco to focus on consolidating his own political command. The new state needed a clear legal and political framework to sustain the personal authority of the leader. In the case of the Falange, this need became urgent after the death of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, who was turned by his followers into a foundational martyr. The disappearance of the Falangist leader left the organization immersed in internal disputes among the founders' relatives, old guard sectors, leaders of different tendencies, and groups with little political experience. The Traditionalist Communion, the political branch of Carlism, also had fractured leadership due to the absence of its historical chief and internal tensions caused by the war. These divisions had to be resolved authoritatively to allow the regime to establish a unified political structure. Franco found his most influential advisor in Ramón Serrano Suñer, the Caudillo's brother-in-law and a trained lawyer. Serrano took up residence in the episcopal palace to carry out his political role and gradually displaced Nicolas Franco from the position of chief advisor. Under his influence, Franco took the decisive step toward creating a new state that would surpass what he called the camp-style state, that is, a purely military regime. The goal was now to transform the uprising into a political enterprise capable of shaping the entire society. In Franco's own words, it was necessary to incorporate the general direction of the movement directly into the state as a state. The objective was realized in April 1937, when the compulsory political unification of the Spanish Falange and the Traditionalist Communion took place, giving rise to a single organization, the Spanish Traditionalist Falange. This new single party was absolutely subordinated to the leadership of the Caudillo. Its creation meant the formal disappearance of the previous political identities and the concentration of all political power in Franco. The unification involved eliminating internal disputes, repressing dissenting sectors, and taming the Falange, which had shown revolutionary and autonomous tendencies. The regime's propaganda formula to justify the operation proclaimed that Franco is not a leader without a party, the Falange is a party without a leader, placing the Caudillo at its head as the undisputed national chief. From this moment, the new unified party adopted symbols and rituals from the Falange, such as the raised arm salute, the yoke and arrows emblem, the blue shirt uniform and red beret, the mystical exaltation of the fallen, but also incorporated elements of the Carlist tradition and the imagery of a religious crusade. In the selection of new leaders, the Falangist orientation prevailed. Only 9 provinces remained under Carlist leadership, while 22 were in Falangist hands. As conservative Carlism had lost political influence, the emerging Spanish fascism consolidated more rapidly. The new state distanced itself from traditional conservative assumptions and adopted features of contemporary totalitarian regimes. Exaltation of the leader, repression of dissent, creation of mass organizations, and absolute control of public life. By mid-1937, the idea of national syndicalism promoted by the Falange began to permeate decrees and speeches. Serrano Suñer frequently emphasized that the movement and the state formed an absolute unity, and that the single party was a counterfigure to the Republic, intended to destroy liberal structures and establish an authoritarian order. The process culminated decisively at the beginning of 1938, when the Caudillo formed his first properly state-level government. The composition of that cabinet showed the balance among the forces supporting the regime: military, phalangists, traditionalists, and Catholics, all subjected to his personal command. At the same time, on January 30th of that year, the law of central state administration was approved, explicitly linking the headship of the state to the presidency of the government and granting the Caudillo the power to issue legal norms with full validity. The law legally consolidated his status as dictator with executive and legislative powers, responsible only before God and history. The new phase intensified repression in the occupied territories. The purge of teaching staff was one of the most visible consequences. By the end of 1938, almost 52,000 teachers had been disqualified, expelled, or sanctioned, along with thousands of secondary and university professors. Any suspicion of sympathy for the Republic was sufficient reason for removal. This process was part of broader repression that included executions, imprisonments, disappearances, and punishments of alleged enemies. The systematic use of terror aimed to eliminate all resistance in the conquered areas. The violent actions of the rebel troops in numerous territories were accompanied by the ideological support of the Catholic hierarchy, which characterized the war as a legitimate crusade. Pastoral Communications in 1937 insisted that the mission of the national movement was to destroy the enemy and purify public life. The press was subjected to strict censorship. The 1938 press law abolished informational freedom, established prior censorship, gave the government the right to appoint directors, and regulated the journalistic profession under total obedience to the single party. The EFE news agency was also created, and the broadcasting service was reorganized to control propaganda. The Aragon Offensive and the advance toward the Mediterranean. The Republican military situation at the beginning of 1938 was critical. The defense of Teruel had consumed enormous human and material resources, leaving entire units of the popular army exhausted. Meanwhile, the Francoist side had reorganized its forces, concentrating African units, elite divisions, heavy artillery, and uncontested air power thanks to the continuous support of Italian aviation and the Condor Legion. Aragon, which for much of the war had been a secondary front characterized by static positions, scattered trenches, and weakened garrisons, suddenly became the primary target of an offensive designed to split Republican territory in two. The prior fall of Teruel had exposed a wide defensive gap and altered the strategic balance of the entire northeastern front. Against this backdrop, the Aragon Offensive was unleashed, an operation designed not only to conquer territory but to destroy the Republic's capacity for resistance in its eastern zone. In the early hours of March 7, 1938, the Francoist forces launched a massive attack along the Aragon front. A simultaneous artillery and aerial bombardment opened breaches in the Republican lines, defended by weakened units with scarce heavy weaponry, very little ammunition, and physical exhaustion after months of fighting. At 6:30 a.m., the ground advance began, led by Moroccan troops, Navarrese divisions, elite brigades, and formations supported by tanks and mobile artillery. The surprise, combined with material superiority, produced an almost immediate collapse of the initial Republican positions. In the following hours, the defenders began a hurried retreat, often leaving behind machine guns, rifles, and positions intact, which facilitated the enemy's progress. In the subsequent days, the offensive unfolded like a chain reaction. On March 10th, Francois troops captured Belchite, a symbolic town due to having been the scene of strong Republican resistance months earlier. Its fall represented for many the confirmation that the Aragon front was collapsing irreversibly. The Republican situation worsened because each improvised retreat exposed a new vulnerable sector. Thus, Francois columns were able to advance rapidly toward Caspi, one of the main administrative centers of the eastern zone, where commands, logistical services, and links with the Catalan rear were concentrated. The Battle of Caspe, fought between March 16th and 17th, sealed the fate of the front. Despite the presence of international brigades and still cohesive units, the enemy push was too intense. François troops overcame resistance street by street and eventually occupied the city. The fall of Caspe dismantled the Republican defense between Zaragoza and Huesca, exposing the depth of Aragonese territory and accelerating the retreat eastward. The offensive continued toward the Pyrenean ranges, where the Gratal Mountains also fell into François' hands. Losing this position not only meant the Popular Army ceded a strategic defensive point, but also allowed enemy forces to penetrate areas near the Gallego Valley, a zone connecting with the Catalan Republican rear. As March progressed, the François columns advanced tens of kilometers without stopping, pushing eastward units that could barely reorganize. The decisive blow came with the conquest of Lleida on April 3rd. This advance was of enormous significance. The city represented the gateway to the interior of Catalonia, and its fall completely broke the Republican defensive continuity. After losing it, the loyal forces attempted to establish new resistance lines upriver, but they were already overwhelmed. At the same time, numerous Republican units became isolated in the mountains. The most emblematic case was the Bolsa de Bielsa, where the 43rd Division resisted for weeks without the possibility of receiving reinforcements and with limited supplies, until it was forced to retreat toward the French border. After crossing the Cinca Valley and the last Pyrenean foothills, the François vanguards embarked on the final stretch toward the Mediterranean. Along their advance, they conquered Mequinenza, Fraga, and other strategic towns whose control was essential to prevent Republican counter-offensives. The exhaustion of the Popular Army was evident. Vehicles were lacking, artillery could not keep pace with the enemy, and the Republican Air Force was no longer capable of operating effectively. François' air superiority was absolute. On April 14th, the troops reached the Mediterranean coast at Vinaròs, and with this, Republican territory was split in two. The central southern zone was physically disconnected from Catalonia, eastern Aragon, and the border strip with France. This rupture had not only territorial but also strategic, logistical, and political consequences. Catalonia became isolated from the main Republican rear, closing off land supply routes, military reorganization, and troop movements. From that point on, any movement between the two zones would require maritime or aerial detours, which were impractical due to François control. Demoralization among Republican ranks was profound. The collapse of the Aragon front revealed the structural weakness of the Popular Army after the Battle of Teruel, the lack of prepared reserves, and the exhaustion of both civilian and military populations. The territorial split also caused internal political tensions, particularly mutual accusations among commanders regarding responsibility, tactical errors, and discipline failures. Meanwhile, the François advance continued in the Castellón area, consolidating the coastal strip that separated the two halves of Republican Spain. The Battle of the Ebro. When the François troops reached the Mediterranean and split Republican territory in two, the government understood that Catalonia was exposed and isolated. The loss of territorial continuity had weakened the maneuvering capacity of the Popular Army, which was forced to hold an overly wide front with increasingly scarce resources. The enemy advance toward the Levante continued to exert pressure, and the possibility of a decisive offensive against Catalonia became more evident each day. Faced with this critical situation, the Republican command decided to concentrate its forces and deliver a strike that would force the François offensive to slow, compelling its commanders to transfer units from Valencia to the Ebro sector. To this end, preparations began for a large-scale operation that required maximum secrecy, precise coordination, and an extreme effort of internal reorganization. The orders established that on the night of the attack, all troops were to silently move toward the designated points on the Catalan bank. For weeks, maps were studied, river meanders examined, and the most favorable fords chosen. Pontoon bridges and removable walkways were built in hidden workshops, while the designated units concentrated far from the front line to avoid detection. The plan sought a simultaneous crossing that would secure bridgeheads before the enemy could react. The logistical effort was enormous. Thousands of men, light artillery, communication equipment, and supplies had to be moved, all under the constant surveillance of enemy aviation. On the night of July 24th to 25th, the units began to move. At 00:30 hours, the crossing began. The first boats advanced silently, taking advantage of the darkness, and successfully reached the enemy bank. The groups tasked with clearing the way neutralized the first obstacles and secured the ground for the landing of subsequent waves. The operation's silence allowed large numbers of troops to cross before the Francois sentries realized what was happening. By dawn, the Republicans had established several bridgeheads and began advancing inland. Within hours, towns near the river were occupied by the attacking forces. The initial surprise dismantled the defenses, and the pace of the advance was faster than expected. Miravet, Benissanet, Rasquera, and Corbera d'Ebre were under Republican control by sunrise. The advance continued toward Gandesa, a key point controlling communications in the comarca. In the early stages of the day, Francois resistance was still weak and dispersed. However, the enemy command reacted quickly and began sending reinforcements from Aragon and the Levante front to contain the offensive. The approach to Gandesa marked a turning point. The city was better defended than the previously occupied towns and had the immediate support of units arriving as reinforcements. For several days, assaults, counterattacks, and intense fighting occurred at the access points, but the Republican forces were unable to capture it. The failure to break this defense shaped the entire subsequent development of the battle. Nevertheless, the Republican positions managed to consolidate across a wide sector that included extremely difficult mountainous areas, especially the Pandols and Cavals ranges. From that moment, Francois aviation began operating constantly. Their bombings targeted not only the forward positions but also the bridges installed by the Republicans over the Ebro. Each destroyed bridge meant an interruption in the supply of ammunition and food and forced exhausted engineering teams to improvise new structures under enemy fire. Still, for several weeks, various crossings remained operational, allowing the offensive to be maintained and some critical positions reinforced. The battle then evolved into a clash of endurance and attrition. The Republicans entrenched themselves on the heights of Pandols and Cavals, from where they could control part of the surrounding terrain. But these heights also became a permanent target for enemy artillery and aviation. The fighting was fierce. Positions frequently changed hands, and often assaults were launched to recapture a hill that had cost dozens of casualties the previous day. The summer heat, lack of water, and scarcity of supplies worsened the troops' situation, with soldiers enduring days of bombardment without the possibility of immediate relief. Throughout August, Francois pressure increased with new reinforcements. The command reorganized its divisions and launched successive offensives aimed at dislodging the defenders from the heights. The material imbalance began to be felt. Francois aviation operated almost unopposed. Artillery struck continuously and Republican communications were interrupted due to damage to bridges and roads. Attacking units were forced to retreat a few kilometers, though they still held some strategic points that hindered enemy progress. By September, the situation became critical for the defenders. Casualties were very high, battalions were incomplete, and the lack of ammunition prevented the maintenance of continuous fire barriers. Medical posts were overwhelmed, and many wounded remained for days without evacuation. Nevertheless, political directives insisted on continuing the battle to delay enemy plans in other sectors. Francois' command resumed coordinated attacks that eventually fractured the defenses in the hardest-hit areas. Gradually, the Republican positions began to fall. In October, the retreat accelerated. Exhausted after weeks of fighting in rough terrain, Republican troops could no longer hold a coherent line. The enemy had regained almost all the points captured at the beginning of the offensive, and the supply bridges were under constant fire, making their maintenance increasingly difficult. Republican command ordered maximum resistance to ensure an orderly withdrawal, but the enemy's artillery and air superiority made prolonging their presence on the river's right bank increasingly risky. On October 30th, the evacuation began. Units crossed the Ebro under continuous fire, with enemy aviation attacking the crossings and roads leading to the river. The retreat was conducted in stages, with some battalions covering others to prevent an immediate collapse. Engineers tried to keep the bridges standing long enough to allow the passage of the last forces, but many were destroyed before they could be fully used. On November 16th, the last Republican position on the right bank fell, ending the battle. The fall of Catalonia Republican territory had been split in two, and Catalonia became an isolated stronghold surrounded by the sea and territory already in rebel hands, with only the French border as an escape route. The defeat at the Ebro had severely weakened the popular army in Catalonia. Many veterans had died or were wounded. Lost equipment had not been replaced, and Soviet aid had practically ceased, while Germany and Italy continued supplying Franco. On paper, Catalonia still had an army group of the eastern region with about 300,000 men, but a considerable portion were young recruits, poorly armed and poorly trained, supported by an air force in poor condition, with 1/3 of the aircraft inoperable. After delaying the attack due to bad weather, on December 23, 1938, the Francois army launched its decisive offensive. Along the Segre River, which marked the line between the two sides, Franco's troops broke the Republican front that same day. The government urgently sent Enrique Lista's V Army Corps, which managed to contain the penetration for 12 days at the cost of heavy casualties, temporarily preventing the enemy from advancing en masse at the vertex between the Ebro and Segre. However, winter rains increased the Ebro's flow, initially preventing Yagué's troops from crossing in the south, so the offensive focused on the western bank of the Segre, where pressure was constant. The bad weather temporarily hindered the power of Francois aviation, allowing Republicans to take cover in ravines and forests. But on January 3rd, an attack with tanks forced another retreat. That same day, Yagué's units finally crossed the Ebro and attacked from the southern flank, threatening a large-scale encirclement. With the improvement of the weather, the rebel air force began operating at full strength, striking the fragile Republican supply lines and hampering the movement of their units. The attacks continued. On January 4th, the rebels advanced on Borjas Blancas, and the break in the front turned the Republican retreat into a disorderly flight. On January 5th, Borjas Blancas and Artesa de Segre fell. The sector was left virtually undefended. The veterans still defending the angle between the Ebro and Segre, many survivors of the Ebro, fled under the risk of being encircled, while the Francoists consolidated a bridgehead at Asco from which to launch new attacks supported by vastly superior logistics. Vicente Rojo tried to organize successive lines of defense, L1, L2, L3 and L4, but they were poorly manned and one by one were surrounded or overrun within a few days. The material inferiority was even more decisive than the numerical one. The Republic had not recovered the weapons lost at the Ebro, while the Francois troops had abundant artillery, aviation, and ammunition from abroad. Even so, the government tried to improvise extreme solutions. On January 9th, it mobilized replacements from 1922 and 1924 to make up for the lack of men. But the problem was not only manpower. Rifles, uniforms, food, and time to train recruits were lacking. On January 8th, the rebels resumed their advance and captured Mont Blanc on the 12th. On the 14th, Valls fell, allowing the concentration of maximum forces on Tarragona. The defensive lines organized by Rojo were quickly overcome, and around Barcelona there were hardly any positions capable of operating. Yagué led his Moroccan Army Corps along the Mediterranean coast, encountering little resistance, as much of the loyal forces were absorbed defending the western flank. The attack from the south could not be stopped by the few battalions assigned to Tarragona. Yagué's troops entered Tarragona and Reus on January 15th, opening the route to Barcelona, which in the meantime was suffering daily aerial bombings similar to those endured by Madrid in 1936. On January 16th, the government decreed a general mobilization of citizens of both sexes between 17 and 55 years old and the militarization of all industries. But the measure came too late to organize an effective defense. To the pressure of the front, increasingly close to the capital, was added a supply crisis caused by thousands of refugees flocking to Barcelona from all over Catalonia, fleeing the enemy advance. Daily bombings of the capital began on January 17th. On the 18th, Negrin and the Council of Ministers declared a state of war, granting the Popular Army civil authority in the rear and subordinating political authorities. But when the front line was already about 25 kilometers from the center, these decisions had little practical effect. The city lacked sufficient equipment and ammunition for a prolonged defense, and the demoralization of troops and civilians was extreme. Many Catalan recruits no longer believed victory was possible. After 2.5 years of war, most civilians considered the conflict lost. Upon learning of Tarragona's fall, the front was exposed once again, and the retreat turned into a chaotic flight of refugees. Authorities, officials, party members, civilians and soldiers began moving toward the French border, sometimes without even stopping in Barcelona. France, fearing the massive arrival of refugees in the Pyrenees, decided to open the border crossings on January 20th, initially to allow the entry of war material destined for the Republic, not to organize a defense or host all the fugitives. The human tide moving north transmitted contagious defeatism to the troops still expected to fight. Many soldiers came from the baby bottle draft and other very young or very old replacements, unwilling to continue fighting what seemed an inevitable outcome. On the morning of January 22nd, Vicente Rojo informed Negrin and the Council of Ministers that the front had broken again between Manresa and Sitges, about 20 kilometers from Barcelona. Republican units were abandoning their positions to take shelter within the city itself. After hearing the report, Negrin ordered the evacuation of all government bodies to Girona and Figueres, closer to the border. Civilian vehicles were requisitioned for January 23rd, but secrecy was impossible. The exodus of officials and the withdrawal of state institutions conveyed the idea that Barcelona was, in practice, already indefensible. That same night, news of the government's departure spread among civilians and refugees, triggering a new wave of mass flight. Since January 23rd, thousands of Republican supporters left Barcelona with their families and belongings, emptying food warehouses to stock up on the way to France. Cars, trucks, bicycles, and a multitude of people on foot saturated the northern road. Officials hurriedly packed files. Documents and identity cards were burned in the streets by militants of various parties to prevent them from falling into the hands of the victors, while firefighters tried to extinguish fires in political headquarters. Prisoners of the rebel side still confined in the city were also taken out of the jails to be dragged along in the retreat. On January 24th, a new military commander of Barcelona was appointed, but amid disorganization and disconnection from the reality of the front, effective defense never materialized. The city experienced a climate of emptiness and defeat. Some communist leaders tried to organize fortification battalions, decree the cessation of all non-war-related activities, and erect obstacles on the avenues to slow the enemy's entry. But the population, seized by fear, remained in their homes or continued fleeing north. The flow of rural and urban refugees, trucks loaded with furniture, cages, mattresses, and frightened children clogged the exits. Later testimonies described a silent, almost dead Barcelona 2 days before the arrival of the troops. Meanwhile, the Francoist advance continued. On January 25th, their units took Sabadell, Terrassa, and the Prat airfield. At dawn on the 26th, they reached the peaks of Tibidabo and Montjuic. By midday, they entered the center of a half-empty city and occupied Barcelona without encountering organized resistance. The Francoist Fifth Column emerged onto the streets after 2.5 years of clandestinity, celebrating the arrival of the rebels. The few loyal troops remaining evacuated north along with thousands of refugees, while the wounded left hospitals, trying not to fall into the victors' hands. With Barcelona lost, the Francoist advance continued unabated. The capture of the Montserrat monastery, loaded with religious and political symbolism for the Catalans, was particularly painful. The next objective was Girona, occupied on February 3rd, while 2 days earlier the last session of the Cortes of the Second Republic on Spanish territory was secretly held in the castle of Figueres. Only part of the government could settle in Figueres, the rest dispersed throughout the region. Azaña and Negrin took refuge in Agullana, which for a few days served as the Republican capital. Companies and Aguirre settled in Lavajol. This dispersion prevented any coordinated action. On February 4th, it was decided that Presidents Azaña, Companies, and Aguirre would cross into France to avoid being captured. Figueres fell on February 8th, and on the 9th, the national troops reached the border and occupied the Pyrenean passes. A Francois dispatch, dated February 10th, declared the Catalonia offensive over after 50 days of operations. As the front collapsed, the exodus from Barcelona and the rest of Catalonia became the largest of the entire war. Hundreds of thousands of people began the march to France, many on foot, enduring the cold and lack of food. At the Pyrenean passes, endless lines of refugees formed. At first, the French authorities only allowed those with a passport and visa to cross, very few, and the rest were forced to camp wherever they could. Overwhelmed, the French eventually set up camps to concentrate the arrivals and opened the border first to women, children, and the elderly, and later also to combatants. In just 4 days, about 300,000 soldiers crossed the border and destroyed their equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. In total, nearly 500,000 people embarked on the path of exile, the largest exodus in Spanish history, while the Francois troops consolidated their control over Catalonia and the remnants of the Republican government dispersed on the other side of the border. On March 28, 1939, Francois troops entered Madrid. After the Republican retreat and the gradual abandonment of defense, the city was exposed to enemy occupation. Fighting had intensified in the preceding days in the University City area, where the 12th Francois Division, along with other units, advanced on various fronts: the Puente de los Franceses, the dentistry, medicine and pharmacy buildings, the Paseo de Rosales, the area of the old Modelo prison, and the Metropolitan Stadium. The pressure was such that the 16th National Division penetrated the University City, while other divisions entered via the Puente de Toledo and the La Coruña Road. By midday on the 28th, Francois troops occupied much of Madrid, and on the 29th they began the official handover of buildings and urban services to the new authority. On that day, a military decree was also imposed. A state of war was declared in the province, giving total jurisdiction to the military command, placing crimes, arrests and security orders under its control. With Madrid already taken, the focus shifted to definitively ending the conflict. On April 1, 1939, General Franco, from his headquarters in Burgos, signed the so-called final report of the war. In that brief communiqué, broadcast by the official radio, it proclaimed, "The war has ended. National troops have achieved their last military objectives. Red Army captured and disarmed." The report formally ended 3 years of conflict following the victory of the rebel forces. That same date was established as the official end of the conflict and marked the beginning of a new stage under Franco's command. The military and symbolic logic of the regime required consolidating its victory before the population. A few days later, a major public display was prepared to ratify that power. A parade of the victorious forces was organized in Madrid, called the Victory Parade of Madrid of 1939. The capital's streets were decorated with red and yellow flags, portraits of the Caudillo, and slogans of patriotic exultation. Military units were enlisted, and the public was called to witness the demonstration of the new order. Meanwhile, within the Republican sphere, a new crisis erupted. Casado's command, which had negotiated the surrender in the face of the Francois advance, was completely delegitimized among the defenders. Madrid had been handed over almost without organized resistance, and the population, exhausted from years of war, hunger and bombings, watched the return of the rebel troops with no capacity to react. With Franco's entry into Madrid, his army consolidated the occupation. The victorious forces began to control the territory not merely as conquerors of a front, but as an absolute government. Military jurisdiction replaced civil authority. Hundreds of citizens were placed on blacklists, and raids and purges were prepared. Houses, public buildings, institutions, everything came under the authority of the regime. The capture of the capital de facto imposed a new political, military and social order throughout Spain. The Victory Parade, held shortly afterwards, symbolized this change. Numerous units paraded along the Paseos del Prado, Recoletos and Castellana, renamed according to the new regime, before thousands of citizens who acclaimed the victor. It was a display of power, presence and legitimacy. The event sought to reaffirm the authority of the Caudillo and seal the victory before the nation and the world. With the official surrender, the occupation of Madrid and the public celebration of victory, the cycle of the war came to a close. Weapons were silenced, armies defeated, and command rested in Franco's hands. From that moment, the Francois dictatorship was consolidated, repression was imposed, and thousands of Spaniards were left at the mercy of the new regime. The violence following the war resulted in approximately 350,000 direct fatalities, caused both by military actions and repression carried out in the rear through informal executions or formal trials. To these deaths were added tens of thousands more resulting from disease, famine, and deprivation that marked the early years of the regime. The overall figures mentioned in the text raise the total human cost to a minimum of 651,000 victims and a maximum of 735,000, representing between 2.63% and 2.97% of the Spanish population recorded in 1936. The post-war period added around 30,000 deaths due to Francoist repression and between 346,000 and 380,000 due to excess mortality compared to the previous period caused by the deterioration of living conditions. Alongside the war dead, there were the political victims of the Francoist victory. Only part of the country ceased to be a target of violence, as many people had to pay for their sympathy toward the Republic. By 1940, more than 300,000 prisoners were crowded into around 500 jails or prisons adapted for that purpose, whereas before the war there were barely a few thousand common inmates in Spain.